It's the politicians who decide whether to go to war or not. But in the pursuit of victory, they don't always take advice.
If a politician actually has his way against the advice of his military people, it can lead to disaster.
And no political system is immune to politicians determined to get their way. They ignore advice and sidestep debate.
To allow a debate to go on once you've made a decision can only erode your determination.
And in turn, kings, dictators, and presidents have used war to pursue their own political ends, be they survival, ideology, or sheer greed.
It was greedy, it was for power. The larger the empire, the better.
The president was quite determined that we not lose time.
He wanted to ensure his own survival as ruler of the King of Jerusalem.
And politicians have caused huge military blunders in their pursuit of politics by other means. The 11th century, when politics was religion, and an age dominated by the conflict between Islam and Christianity, both believing they had a divine right to control the Holy Lands. The Christians staked their claim by mounting an invasion from across the sea, determined to slaughter the Muslim infidel.
They came in the name of God. They came because they believed that through slaughter, each individual would seek redemption. By violence, they would open the kingdom of heaven for themselves.
The First Crusade made a decision. The non-Christian inhabitants should be so terrorized that they would run away. Now, that policy of ethnic cleansing culminated in the sack of Jerusalem.
It was an absolute bloodbath. Men rode with their horses up to their bridles in blood, splashed with blood, in other words. And on the great Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, the golden center of Islam, there was an enormous massacre of women and children. And they set up on top of it a great golden cross as a symbol of their power.
And after the massacre, the Crusaders built a kingdom centered in what is now present-day Israel. It mirrored the European countries they had come from.
They set up castles, they dominated the neighborhoods, they collected money from the locals. This was, in a real sense, a Western colony.
The feudal kingdom was divided among powerful lords who held absolute rule in their own lands.
Within their own areas, they could act as a kind of summit of judgment.
In turn, the lords swore loyalty to a king, the person ultimately in charge of the kingdom's defense. And in 1186, the throne was held by Guy of Lusignan. But this king's standing was at rock bottom because of a political scandal. 3 years before, Muslims had invaded the kingdom. Then, Guy had decided against open battle. Instead, he held back until lack of supplies forced the Muslims to retreat. It was a military success, but for him, a political disaster.
It's a very successful approach, but Guy is pilloried for it. The more aggressive people in the Kingdom of Jerusalem say, you should have fought. You had all the people assembled. You were a coward.
And if sleaze has challenged politicians' credibility in recent times, cowardice carried an equally damaging stigma in the 12th century.
For a king to be accused of cowardice was really a very serious crime indeed. It made him look not merely a fool and a knave, it made him look useless, because if he was a coward, how could he lead you in battle?
In an attempt to avoid further accusations, King Guy was to lose his crown and kingdom. Another war with the Muslims was approaching. This time, it was provoked by a renegade crusader, Reginald of Chatillon.
He is a man who has great motivation for attacking the Islamic faith. He spent 13 years in a Muslim prison. He was captured cattle raiding. And when he gets out, he is determined to gain his revenge.
Reginald's castle looked down on a trail along which Muslim convoys passed. The temptation for revenge was too great, and he attacked, killing everyone. It would prove the start of King Guy's downfall. The attack was considered an act of war in the Muslim world. There, the military leader, Saladin, had unified competing Muslim factions under the common cause of taking back the Holy Lands for Islam. But now, Saladin was under pressure to deliver on that promise, or his alliance would crumble.
It's a precarious alliance. He cannot hold it together for very long. He needs to achieve results. He needs to carry out his promises that the Christians will be removed.
But Saladin was faced with a dilemma. To stand even a chance of success, he had to ensure King Guy's army faced him in battle.
He cannot afford a situation where he enters the Crusader territory and they don't fight. If his Muslim coalition goes home again without capturing an important city, or better still, a decisive victory in battle, I'm sure that it would have dissolved.
Saladin came up with an inspired plan to tempt King Guy's army into battle. In 1187, he entered the Crusader kingdom and laid siege to one of their castles.
He goes to Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, and there he attacks the city, in which the wife of the most senior leading man amongst the Crusaders. And he takes the city, and she is besieged just in the castle. She is the damsel in distress. And that puts the Crusaders into a terrible dilemma.
Saladin knew that in an age of chivalry, the Crusader army was obliged to attempt a rescue. But to do so meant advancing across a waterless terrain, a highly dangerous move. Not only would heat and thirst take their toll, but King Guy's army would be exposed to attack from all sides. Saladin waited as the Crusaders pondered a solution to the dilemma he'd spun for them.
What were they to do? Were they to sit and watch it happen? Or were they to do something about it? And yet to go forward was to go forward into what is not a desert, but a waterless stretch of road.
It was King Guy who had to decide whether the Crusader army should advance or not. But in making his decision, Guy had to listen to the opinion of the kingdom's powerful lords. And a huge row had broken out among them over what to do. The kingdom's most powerful military commander, Gerard, was hell-bent on attacking the Muslims. He believed the Holy Lands had to be defended at all costs.
You have a kingdom which is fired, inspired, you might say, by the need to conquer Islam, by the need to ever expand the kingdom of God. And in political terms, that means some people take an expansionist view. We must always and ever be at blood with Islam.
In contrast, the most senior of the king's advisors, Raymond, believed it was best to wait. He maintained that without a battle, the Muslim coalition would break up and retreat. It was an approach rooted in military logic.
The problem that Crusaders face is you've got maybe 600-700 knights maximum. If you engage in a battle and you're heavily defeated and all those men are killed, there is nobody left to defend the holy places.
King Guy summoned the great lords to a council of war. It was his opportunity to listen to the clashing opinion of the day. The hawks and doves would now debate whether to engage the Muslims in battle. And then Guy would make his decision.
The hawks are obviously going to hope to engage the Muslims in battle. They should maybe take Saladin on and throw him out of their land. On the other hand, you have a more dove-like approach. If we are defeated and all our knights are killed, the kingdom will fall.
King Guy was the king. That was decisive. It was his decision in the end. And he has to hold the kingdom together and hold these clashing opinions and personalities together. The end of the evening, after all the argumentation, King Guy agreed that they would sit it out. The whole army went to sleep, confident that in the morning there would be no fighting.
The decision in the tent on the first meeting is that they should not fight. The doves win the day. It is a cold, calculated military decision that it would be better not to engage in battle.
But later that night, King Guy had reason to doubt his decision. He had another meeting, but this time only with Gerard, the warlord, who was still intent on attacking the Muslims. And the hawk presented a political argument for fighting.
What he said to King Guy was, look, if you sit here, they'll accuse you of cowardice again, so that when Saladin's gone away, you'll be a crippled king. Why don't you fight? You've got the greatest army the kingdom has ever had.
As the night ebbed away, the king pondered his dilemma. To advance, he knew he risked defeat, but if he didn't, the accusation of cowardice could cost him his throne. Finally, Guy ordered his army to advance, and in going into battle, Guy was pursuing politics by other means, for in war, he sought his own political survival.
Guy made a political decision. He wanted to ensure his own survival as ruler of the King of Jerusalem. And in making that decision, he turned aside from the conventional military wisdom of the time.
Guy's army began their advance across the waterless terrain, but Saladin was waiting for them, and he attacked.
What seems to be the Muslim tactics were gently to push the army further and further off the road into the rough scrubland, into an area which was waterless.
And with every step it takes, it sweats to its own death, if you like. So Saladin's whole tactic is to surround, harass, and make their journey more and more difficult, set grass alight.
The army finds itself marching or camping or whatever, surrounded by acrid smoke. This breeds confusion.
Saladin stands his army off like a crown around the Crusader army. Whichever way it turns, he has the force to hold it in his grip. They were, one source says, dying of thirst. Christian knights asked Saladin if he would kill them and put them out of their misery.
The Christian army eventually ends up on a small hill, one of a pair called the Horns of Hattin, and there the end came.
The Crusader army was destroyed. Saladin released the damsel in distress. Then his Muslim forces swept through the Holy Lands. Finally, they reached Jerusalem, where the Crusaders had so brutally imposed their own rule only 100 years before.
And the first thing he did when he got into the city was drag down the cross from the Dome of the Rock and re-erect there the crescent, which to this day sits over the Dome of the Rock. The consequence of Hattin was disaster in the east.
King Guy, in an attempt to keep his power, had lost his kingdom. His defeat was rooted in his pursuit of politics by other means.
Politicians make the decisions in the light of their own counsels, and very frequently they have very little to do with military means and military power.
Centuries later, another politician was about to take his nation to war. Again, he was driven by his own political agenda. This time, it was sheer greed. Benito Mussolini was laying the basis for a military disaster.
Combattenti, di terra, di mare, dell'aria. Camicie nere della rivoluzione e delle legioni. Il tuo coraggio, il tuo valore.
Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator who seemingly ran Italy single-handedly.
He made himself in charge of everything. He was the Prime Minister of Italy, he was the Duce of Fascism, and he was Minister of War, Minister for the Air, Minister for the Navy. He was everything. So Mussolini has this astonishing illusion that I can run the whole of Italy from my desk.
But Mussolini had political ambitions beyond the total power he enjoyed at home. He wanted to build himself an empire.
As grandiose as it sounds, restoring the ancient Roman Empire with him in the role of a modern Julius Caesar and Augustus combined.
Power is what he wanted. And if he was greedy, it was for power. The larger the empire, the better.
But in Mussolini's Italy, government was more inefficient than the fine-tuned image presented to the world. The building of the Italian war machine, crucial to Mussolini's expansionist dream, was erratic, to say the least.
And there's a story written by one of his generals. He produced to the Duce 4 designs of tanks. And Mussolini pretended to look at them very seriously for about a quarter of an hour and finally said, oh, we'll make that one. And he just pointed to one. Quite a technical business is choosing tanks, very complicated indeed. The fact that that tank never worked properly ever didn't matter because the Duce was seen to be taking action and therefore got the credit for it. In point of fact, he did nothing. And the Italian preparations for war were negligible.
As World War II loomed, Mussolini was presented with an opportunity to realize his imperial ambitions. He would have a natural and powerful ally in the shape of his fellow fascist, Adolf Hitler. And siding with Hitler might bring Italy new territories. But Mussolini knew entering the war with his army so poorly prepared risked defeat. He decided to play a waiting game to see which side looked like winning.
Mussolini came to the conclusion that this war was going to drag on year after year after year with little or no movement until one side basically collapsed from exhaustion. And at that point, the Italians would come into the war on the winning side. He didn't see that as occurring any sooner than it had in the previous war. If this war began in 39, well, maybe in 42 or 43, maybe in 44, the point would come.
But in the first few months of the war, the Germans swept through Europe. And with the war seemingly coming to an end by the spring of 1940, Mussolini had to reconsider his decision not to fight.
If he doesn't come into the war in the spring of 1940, the Germans are going to gather up everything. Italy will be left with nothing. This is not just a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. This is a once-in-a-century or a once-in-a-thousand-year opportunity. They've got to take advantage of it.
Italy entered the war on the German side. And in doing so, Mussolini was pursuing politics by other means. For in war, he was looking to build his empire.
And it's only after the French are within 4 days of appealing for an armistice that Mussolini declares war. I mean, this is the incredible thing. And Mussolini keeps on saying, it's not a fascist thing to hit a man that was down there. We're certainly not going to do that. This is just what he does.
All'Italia, all'Europa, al mondo.
And with Britain fighting for very survival, Mussolini's sights turned to her colonies, an easy target even for an inferior Italian army.
He believes, not incorrectly, that Britain is concentrating what's left of its army to defend the home island. That leaves the Middle East, and in particular Egypt, basically stripped of defenses. Mussolini decides that parallel with Hitler's invasion of Britain, he's going to invade Egypt, conquer the Delta, and seize the Suez Canal, and then probably sweep on through the Middle East to the Persian Gulf oil fields.
Mussolini ordered his troops, then in Libya, to march forward and capture Egypt. But there was a problem, according to Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, in charge of Italian forces in North Africa. They simply lacked the proper equipment for such an advance, and Graziani pleaded with Mussolini for more time.
What Graziani tells Mussolini is that he simply lacks the motor vehicles that he needs to move his army. Graziani isn't so much refusing to move as trying to explain to Mussolini why he can't move quickly. The basic reason is he has got to bring an army on foot through an area which has no resources whatsoever, and these have to be transported all the way from the port of Tripoli, hundreds and hundreds of miles, but most importantly, he needs time in order to build a water pipeline to supply this very large force of foot infantry, which is going to have to move through the western desert.
The Italians progressed at a snail's pace. In turn, an increasingly impatient Mussolini imposed his wishes through an exchange of telegrams with Marshal Graziani. It was a clash of political and military wills.
The telegrams between Graziani and Mussolini, which had been going on for months, became more and more emotional. They also became longer, but the language was a more and more involved way of saying two very simple things. Get moving, I can't. Now, when you read them, sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're tedious, because you see a human being, Mussolini, attempting in a more and more complicated or imaginative way to say, get moving. And you read Graziani's replies, which are a more and more complicated or involved way of saying, I can't.
Britain survived against the Germans, and by September 1940, she had sent reinforcements to North Africa. Crucially, they included tanks, technology vastly superior to anything the Italians possessed.
The British know that the desert is ideal for tank warfare, and so they're prepared to fight a tank war. Mussolini doesn't bother to have any tanks until it's too late in North Africa. He just has an immense number of men who've got to march on foot, if you please, for 1,000 miles in the desert to get to Egypt.
But Mussolini remained convinced of the Italian army's ability to win, and he continued calling for action, driven on by his imperial dream.
I mean, here's a man who has suddenly come to a point where this extraordinary opportunity to grab big chunks of the British Empire, now for him to say, I can't do it. My army isn't in condition. I don't have the equipment. My tanks are hopelessly inferior, is to ask him to give up his lifelong dream. So you're asking Mussolini to change his basic nature at a point where everything that has gone into his makeup is pushing him in one direction. He can't say no to his own imperial dream.
By December 1940, the Italians had camped in Egypt at a place called Sidi Birani. But for Mussolini, this was no time for hesitation.
Well, in effect, Mussolini had put Graziani in a position where he either had to advance or he would be dismissed. And by early December, it was pretty clear to the British back at headquarters in the Nile Delta that the Italians were about to bound forward once again. They decided that they had to strike first before the Italians did. And what this meant was that in the very early morning hours of the 9th of December, it was the British who struck.
In North Africa, 300,000 Italians faced a British force of only 32,000. And in the Battle of Sidi Birani, the Italian army's inadequacies were exposed by the more mobile British force.
They move by motor vehicle, which means that they can move faster and farther than men can on foot. So that the British, in effect, can take shortcuts and constantly cut the Italians off by getting to a point at the highway ahead of them and then building a roadblock so that the Italians are trapped. You're talking about two different rates of speed, two different rates of ability to think and to communicate.
Outmaneuvered and outwitted, the Italian army suffered defeat after defeat. By early 1941, over 130,000 Italians were taken prisoner in North Africa. In a quote of the day, "Never have so many surrendered to so few." It was a disaster, rooted in Mussolini's sheer political greed and a defeat for the political system he had imposed on the Italian nation.
Mussolini despises democracy. He thinks that fascism is the answer to political problems, failing to realize that democracy, although it's not an ideal form of government, does have one immense advantage. The questions are dragged out into the open and are discussed. So somebody can come in and say, no, wait a moment, it's not quite right, don't do that.
But all democracy's checks and balances can be undermined by determined politicians. Decades later, not greed but ideology would drive a politician to war. It was 1983, and the most powerful man in the world decided to stop the spread of communism.
The Caribbean is a very important passageway for our international commerce and military lines of communication. More than half
The United States of America, the land of the free, and Ronald Reagan. The 40th president was elected in an era possessed by the Cold War, an age which reflected his own political obsession to fight the spread of communism.
The president came to office with one or two deeply held views of international politics. One was ideological in that we had a fundamental obligation as the leader of the free world to resist the expansion of Soviet influence and determined that it not expand further on his watch.
And in 1983, the president's eyes turned to the Marxist state of Grenada, a former British colony and one of the smallest islands in the Caribbean. There, an airport was being built by Cubans. The Americans viewed it as a launchpad for communist expansion in the Caribbean, a threat in their own backyard.
At the southern end of the Caribbean chain, the Cubans, with Soviet financing and backing, are in the process of building an airfield with a 10,000-foot runway. The rapid buildup of Grenada's military potential is unrelated to any conceivable threat to this island country of under 110,000 people.
The Grenadians insisted the airport was solely a means to expand tourism on the island, and funded, among others, by Finland and the United Kingdom.
17 countries have provided the funds to build that international airport. The Cubans said from day one, we can help you through materials, through labor, through engineers, etc., to the tune of 40% of the project. The other 60% you have to find.
And the Grenadians invited Western journalists to come and see their civilian airport.
What mystifies many Grenadians is that the Americans went to enormous lengths to get these satellite and aerial photographs of this installation, when it's quite possible for anybody who wishes to come here and take photographs to their heart's content at ground level.
In October 1983, a power struggle in Grenada's ruling party saw the Prime Minister killed. President Reagan, already troubled by the Cuban presence, now saw Grenada unstable. American students were studying on the island, and he decided they were prime targets in a repeat of the Iranian hostage crisis.
It was obvious that he was not going to fall into a situation as we had in Tehran. I mean, he was elected for two reasons. One was the lousy U.S. economy, and the second was the humiliation in the eyes of the American people for 444 days of the hostage-taking.
But the impression of danger was just that, an impression, according to Dr. George Albert, then a medical student on the island.
I had talked to several St. George's medical students, and they told me stories of having intramural basketball teams with the Cubans years before. I never had a sense that the Cubans were threatening to me personally. I co-lived with them on this island, and they did what they had to do to build this runway. The ultimate question is whether we were in danger. If the answer is, frankly, I was not in any physical danger.
Real or imagined, the threat was enough for President Reagan to order an invasion of Grenada. It was an act of war. The most powerful man in the world was pursuing politics by other means. An invasion to rescue US citizens also presented a military opportunity to stamp out communism on the island once and for all.
It was a Soviet-Cuban colony being readied as a major military bastion to export terror and undermine democracy.
The invasion was codenamed Operation Urgent Fury. Somebody had to be found to lead it. The name of Vice Admiral Joseph Metcalfe III was put into the hat.
He said, "Don't you have some kind of a 3-star admiral down there in Norfolk? Can't he do this sort of thing?" And he said, "Oh yes, the commander of the 2nd Fleet. He'd be ideal. In fact, it's in his area." And so, bang, that's how I became in charge.
I ordered a flotilla of ships to circle south on a course that would put them somewhere in the vicinity of Grenada in case there should be a need to evacuate our people.
I was following my orders. It was just do it quickly. It was political pressure, but I wasn't involved with that.
In his determination to rid Grenada of communism, President Reagan wanted the invasion carried out quickly. It allowed him to avoid the most serious of political debates any country can hold, the question of going to war.
To allow a debate to go on once you've made a decision can only erode your determination, undermine morale, and prejudice, just by the passage of time, the success of the operation. He wanted this done as quickly as possible to avoid that.
It was a Soviet-Cuban colony being readied as a major military bastion to export terror and undermine democracy. We got there.
President Reagan, at the helm of the biggest democracy in the world, successfully stifled debate. American politicians first heard about the invasion through the medium of television.
We were in the process of legislating at that time. The TVs were on, and we saw news flash on TV.
Was to minimize risk, to avoid casualties to our own men.
It is rather embarrassing, I would say, to be a member of Congress and to learn that your country has just invaded another country from a television set instead of through a communication from the President of the United States.
But doubts about the invasion did surface. The American armed forces were alarmed at the speed President Reagan wanted to proceed. It meant little military intelligence could be gathered about Grenada. The American forces wanted more time. A meeting was held in the White House with Caspar Weinberger representing the interests of the military.
Combat bridge, contact.
I also thought it proper to warn him that there could be casualties. It would be necessary to move very rapidly without the normal pre-landing intelligence that we would like to have. We would ideally would have liked another week to get ready and to get more troops in and all the rest.
The military was concerned about how poor the intelligence was. Cap Weinberger, in asking for more time, and led the president to be increasingly short Pentagon and saying, we need to do this. The president was quite determined that we not lose time.
With political pressure to get on, the crack Navy reconnaissance team, the SEALs, was sent in to gather intelligence.
Unfortunately, it was a disaster because they drowned. They dropped them into the water, and they went straight to the bottom. They hadn't practiced to do this sort of thing. It was a disaster. It was a disaster. And well, just one of the things, once again, it's part of the fog of war.
The loss of life was always quite sobering to the president, but he said, let's press on. We've got to do this, and the sooner we can, the better off we'll be.
So preparations for the invasion continued, but with little intelligence gathered. And opposition emerged from a normally staunch American ally, Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister. It seemed the lady had turned. Mrs. Thatcher opposed the invasion of a member of the Commonwealth, and an argument broke out between the best of friends over the question of peace and war.
The Prime Minister was quite severe in criticizing the operation, and indeed insisting that he not do it, that using terms such as, Ron, you really must reconsider this. The president was shaken and went through the reasons for it. Margaret, I'm concerned seriously about the potential longer-term threat of a Soviet presence. So the president, courteous to the end, thanked her, closed the call. He shook his head, and he was a lonely figure, somewhat ashen, really. But it didn't lead him to say, let's reconsider or let's delay. He said, Bud, tell the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Godspeed, get on with it.
And at 5:15 this morning, the Joint Force...
On the 25th of October, 1983, Operation Urgent Fury was launched.
There he is, fire, down.
Just 36 hours after his appointment, Vice Admiral Metcalf presided over a huge American force. At his disposal were 7,300 troops, dozens of fighter aircraft, and 15 warships. In contrast, Grenada didn't even have a navy. But even the sheer might of the American forces couldn't hide their lack of preparations. Specifically, their maps of the area were outdated tourist maps, available free from petrol stations.
The charts the Army used were Esso. You know, Esso gave way to Exxon a long time ago, so you can imagine how old they were. The chart we used on the ship was dated, I think, of 1895. But the intelligence as to what the topology of land was not very good. But we made do.
On the first day of the invasion, one of the American military objectives was to neutralize Grenadian opposition by destroying their military headquarters. But the lack of intelligence was to play its part.
A command post, a central command post, was located on top of a hill. It just so happened that on this hill was also located a hospital. Like so many things, we didn't know the hospital was there. It was clearly not marked in any of our charts or anything. And we decided to take out this particular command post using aircraft.
It was a disaster. Instead of hitting the command post, the Americans bombed the hospital, killing 17 civilians.
And a lot of them was bawling and running, some in blood and this sort of thing. And I could remember there were two nurses. One of them came to me and they say, "Fool, oh God, why do you see dead people down there?" With tears in the eyes and things. I say, "So, girl, this is the price of war. No, we didn't attack our country. We were attacked by foreign forces." It was a sad thing. It was a sad thing.
I'm sure somebody knew the hospital was there. But what priority do you give it? I mean, I didn't give it any priority whatsoever. It's a very, you know, if we'd been there, you know, for a week or so, we would have plotted all these things.
Well, this is in keeping with the Americans and their standard. They always get things wrong. They always get things wrong.
The invasion continued, and so did the mistakes. Another stated American military objective was to rescue the British Governor-General. During the invasion, he was here at his official residence. But the Americans were in a state of general confusion over his whereabouts. The then Secretary of Defense believed he was in jail.
Well, we were told he was in prison, and he also sent a note out from prison saying he was in prison. So we had every reason to believe he was in prison.
Well, the only time I visited Richmond Hill Prison when I was a member of the visiting committee. That was long before I was Governor General. I've never been imprisoned by anybody or threatened to be.
Our information was, and his testimony in his letter was, that he was being held in confinement in a jail. One of the first objectives after he freed the students was to go up to the jail and as I remember it, free him.
But he wasn't in jail.
Well, he thought he was.
The invasion continued, and the fog of war thickened. The American president's stated aim for the invasion was to rescue medical students on the island. But there were no hard facts. The students' whereabouts were unknown.
The fact is, nobody knew where the students were. When we first landed there, we thought that they were at the end of the airport. And indeed, at one end of the airport, they had a campus there. But they also had a campus called the Grand Anne's campus, which we didn't know anything about.
And amid the general confusion, it seems the American forces may have fired on the very people they were meant to save.
It was one side of the dorm that faced the waterfront that was riddled with bullet holes. And I remember students saying that were in those dorms during some firefight. Grenadians didn't have a navy. So you would assume that if bullets were on the waterfront side of a dorm, that it was not Grenadians or Cubans, that it would have been the American forces shooting in that direction.
4 days after the invasion began, the Americans did finally secure Grenada, and President Reagan's pursuit of politics by other means was realized. The government was replaced, and communism on the island was crushed. But it came at a cost. 19 American servicemen and 67 Grenadians had lost their lives. Then a row broke out in America. Opposition politicians questioned if the invasion had been justified.
What would happen if the same set of circumstances existed in a country that could fight back?
They included Democrat Congressman Louis Stokes. He visited Grenada as part of a congressional inquiry. He found no communist threat. The airport was what the Grenadians had maintained all along, a means to expand tourism. The American president, he said, had reacted to a communist threat which just didn't exist.
What had happened was that we had under these type of false pretenses, invaded this little island, nor the people there were in any means any kind of a threat to the United States, nor did it really provide, in any case, a staging area for the Soviets and the Cubans to expand communism.
With 1,000 Americans, including some 800 students on that island, we weren't about to wait for the Iran crisis to repeat itself, only this time in our own neighborhood. In a free society, there's bound to be disagreement about any decisive course of action. Some of those so quick to criticize our operation in Grenada, I invite them to read the letters I've received from those students and their families. They know this was no invasion. They know it was a rescue mission.
An embattled president was engulfed in a potentially damaging debate, one he had avoided when launching his invasion. But his critics were silenced by the returning medical students. When one of them kissed the ground, it proved the defining political moment in a disaster-ridden saga.
What a great bunch. Now that's the singular most important political act in the grenade operation. It took care of all our problems. Took care of the wounded people in the hospital. Friendly fire. I mean, it became a non-problem. Grenada was a political action. It wasn't a military operation, it was a political one. And so you have, so there's nothing wrong with you asking political questions. But I'm answering you basically, based on you want to ask political questions, go ask the politicians. That's not my area of expertise.
For President Reagan, Grenada had proved a success, reflected in the 30,000 medals awarded to servicemen. The invasion had achieved an important result for America. It was the largest military engagement since the Vietnam War. And 2 decades after that defeat, President Reagan had sent out a message to the world. He wasn't to be messed with.
There's no doubt that the actual intervention, invasion, whatever you want to call it, was a watershed in American foreign policy. This was not some cowboy from California. That he was serious. That he would not just sit there and go woo woo. He would do something about it, which I think was in doubt in the eyes of many people prior to that.
From a king who wanted to preserve his rule, to a dictator motivated by imperial ambitions, to a president's fight against an enemy which never was, politicians of all shades have caused military blunders by ignoring their military advisors and using war to pursue their own political ends.
Politics has its imperatives, and military men in the end are the creatures of politics. And military men may have their expertise and may offer their counsel, but in the end politicians make the decisions, and very often they leave to soldiers on the battlefield impossible tasks.